England, 1944. The lorry rattled through darkness on a country road outside Manchester, its blackout curtains pulled tight against windows that showed nothing but the faint silhouettes of trees. Inside, 30 German women sat pressed together on wooden benches, breathing the close air of confinement and fear. They had been told what to expect from British night patrols: violence in the darkness, hands reaching for them in the confusion of blackout, the things that happened to captured women when no witnesses could see. What they encountered instead made them question everything they'd been taught about British barbarism, about the weakness of democracy, about what happens to prisoners in enemy hands. The journey had begun 2 months earlier, on a cold morning in occupied France. Margaret Schmidt stood among 150 women in a temporary detention facility outside Calais, her Luftwaffe auxiliary uniform still bearing traces of ash from the radar station where she'd worked until the Allied advance overran their position. She was 28, a signals operator who had tracked British bombers across the Channel for 3 years. Around her, other women from the Women's Auxiliary Services, factory workers from the Ruhr who'd been caught in France during evacuation, nurses who'd served in field hospitals, even 2 actresses from Berlin who'd been performing for troops when the front collapsed. They had expected immediate execution. Everything Goebbels had said on the radio was clear. The British were monsters, weakened by Jewish influence and racial mixing, who showed captured enemies no mercy. The English invented the concentration camp in South Africa, didn't they? These island people with their crumbling empire would surely take revenge on German women for the Blitz, for the V-weapons, for years of war. Instead, they received British Army blankets, medical examinations by female doctors, and grey wool dresses with POW stencilled on the back in black letters. The letters felt like a brand, marking them as property of His Majesty's forces. The crossing to England was nightmare enough without violence. Seasickness, the diesel smell thick in the hold, the constant motion of grey water under steel. Women clutched photographs of husbands, children, parents they might never see again. Margaret kept a small notebook hidden in her sleeve, writing by the faint light that filtered through ventilation grates. July 15th, 1944. They say we go to England. I cannot imagine what awaits us there. The British killed my brother over Hamburg. Will they take that revenge on us? The English Channel was rough even in summer, the ship rolling through swells that sent women reaching for buckets, for walls, for anything solid. Some prayed in whispers. Others sat in silence, faces grey as the sea outside. When the engines changed pitch and the ship began to slow, hearts seized with new terror. This was it. The moment they would learn what British revenge looked like. The port was Southampton, grey docks under grey skies that seemed to press down like a weight. British soldiers lined the gangways, not the monsters of propaganda, but men who looked tired, professional, many of them older than the young fanatics in the SS. Their uniforms were worn, but clean. Weapons held casually, no aggression in their postures. One soldier, his face weathered like old leather, helped an older German woman navigate the steep gangway stairs. His grip was firm, steadying. Margaret watched this and felt the first crack in her certainty about how this would unfold. The transport lorries were military vehicles, canvas-covered, benches along each side. As they drove north through countryside that should have been bombed into rubble, but instead showed green fields, villages intact, children playing in streets, the women stared in confusion. Where was the devastation? Where were the starving masses? British propaganda always showed them Germany's destruction. Surely England suffered equally from the Luftwaffe raids. The landscape told a different story. Damage here and there, certainly, but nothing like the moonscapes of Hamburg or Cologne. This country was still functioning, still whole, still somehow untouched by total war, in the way Germany was being consumed by it. The camp emerged from rolling hills, like something from another world. Rows of Nissen huts, curved metal structures that looked temporary but solid, arranged in neat lines across what had once been farmland. Wire fencing marked the perimeter, not the electric death fences of concentration camps, but ordinary chain link that could have surrounded any factory or military base. Guard towers stood at intervals, but the guards inside read newspapers, drank tea from thermoses, looked bored rather than brutal. The camp commandant was a British Army major named Thomas Ashworth, a man in his late 40s who'd served in the Great War and carried himself with the weariness of someone who'd seen too much death to enjoy authority. He stood on the steps of the administrative building as the lorries arrived, his uniform pressed despite the heat, his face revealing nothing. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention," he said through a translator, a young woman with a German accent who turned out to be a Jewish refugee. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. "You will work in assigned labour details. You will be fed according to British Army rations. You will be housed in accordance with international law. Most importantly, you will be protected." He paused, letting the translator catch up. "That means protected from harm, from assault, from abuse of any kind. The guards have strict orders. Any violation will result in court-martial." The German women stood in formation, sun hot on their faces, trying to process these words. Protected, fed, housed according to law. It had to be a deception, some elaborate British trick before the real treatment began. Major Ashworth dismissed them to their huts. The buildings were utilitarian but clean. Iron bed frames with thin mattresses, lockers for the few personal items they didn't have, small windows that opened for ventilation. Stoves stood at each end for heating in winter. No luxury, but not the diseased barracks they'd expected. In the corner of each hut, a radio played BBC broadcasts, British voices speaking in measured tones about the war, about politics, about cricket matches and garden competitions, as if the world wasn't burning. "This is psychological warfare," an older woman named Frau Weber muttered. She'd been a party member, her husband an SS officer. "They soften us with comfort, then the torture begins." Margaret wanted to believe her. It would make sense of things, but doubt had begun its quiet work. Morning came with a wake-up call at 6 a.m. Roll call in the compound yard, mist still clinging to the grass, the air cool and damp in that particularly English way. British guards counted the women with methodical precision, checking lists, marking attendance. Then came the march to the mess hall, where the second shock awaited. The mess hall was a large Nissen hut, converted for dining. Long tables with benches, windows on both sides letting in morning light. Women filed through a serving line, expecting the starvation rations that defined wartime Germany. Turnip soup, black bread that was more sawdust than grain, perhaps some potato peelings if you were lucky. What they received instead stopped them in their tracks. Porridge with milk, real milk, not ersatz. Eggs, scrambled and still hot. Toast with butter and jam. Tea with sugar. Portions that weren't generous by peacetime standards, but were impossible by German wartime reality. Margaret stared at her plate as if it might disappear. Around her, women sat frozen, afraid to believe this was real. One woman started crying, tears falling into her porridge. A British guard serving the line, an older man with kind eyes, noticed their hesitation. He gestured toward the food, smiled slightly, kept moving down the line. Permission granted, though unspoken. The women ate carefully, some becoming ill from sudden richness after months of near starvation during the chaotic final days in France. Others ate slowly, deliberately, as if committing each bite to memory. The porridge was thick and warm. The eggs tasted like childhood, like a time before rationing and war. The tea was bitter and sweet at once, ordinary and miraculous. Back in Germany, civilians were eating grass, dandelion leaves, anything to fill the grinding hunger. Here, prisoners ate better than many German citizens ever would again. The work assignments came after breakfast. Some women were assigned to the camp laundry, others to kitchen duty, still others to maintenance work. The labour was real but not punishing. 8-hour shifts with breaks. Water provided constantly because of the summer heat. Supervisors who corrected mistakes with patience rather than violence. And everywhere, British guards going about their duties with professional detachment. The guards were mostly older men, veterans of the Great War, or men deemed unfit for combat duty. They patrolled the perimeter, checked work details, maintained order. But they didn't leer, didn't make threats, didn't use their authority as weapon or leverage. This absence of cruelty confused the women more deeply than violence would have. Everything they'd been taught about British degeneracy, about the weakness of democratic soldiers, about what happened to women in enemy hands, all of it was proving false. Margaret began to observe carefully, recording details in her hidden notebook. The guards changed shifts at precise times, 6 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, 10 at night. The night shift was always smaller, only 4 men for the entire camp. This should have been when the violence occurred, when darkness provided cover for the things propaganda promised. But the night guards simply walked their routes, checked the fence line, occasionally stopped to smoke and talk in low voices that carried across the quiet compound. One evening in late July, Major Ashworth announced a new policy. The women would be allowed to walk within the camp compound during evening hours before curfew. Not outside the fence, but within the perimeter they could move freely, could sit under trees, could talk among themselves without being confined to their huts. This freedom, small as it was, felt dangerous. Freedom meant responsibility. Freedom meant they weren't just bodies to be stored and fed, but people whose choices mattered enough to be permitted. The first evening walk was tentative. Women emerged from their huts like prisoners released from cells, blinking in the long English twilight that stretched past 9 o'clock. They walked in groups, staying close together, watching the guards for signs of threat. But the guards simply nodded as they passed, returned to their posts, let the women discover the space for themselves. It was during one of these evening walks that Margaret first witnessed the night patrol. She'd been sitting under an oak tree at the edge of the compound, writing in her notebook by fading light, when she heard boots on gravel. 2 British guards approaching, doing their evening rounds. Her heart seized. This was it, the moment when the pretense of civilized treatment would end. 2 men, darkness falling, a woman alone. She knew what came next. The guards stopped a respectful distance away. The older one, a sergeant with grey in his hair, spoke in careful English. "Evening, miss. Shouldn't stay out too late. Curfew in half an hour." His voice was neutral, neither friendly nor hostile. The younger guard, perhaps 20, stood silent, his rifle slung over his shoulder, no threat in his posture. They waited a moment to ensure she understood, then continued their patrol, boots crunching on gravel as they walked away into the gathering darkness. Margaret sat trembling, not from assault, but from its absence. These men had found her alone in dim light, and had done nothing but remind her of curfew. No hands reaching, no whispered threats, no exploitation of power and isolation. Just 2 soldiers doing their job, treating her as a prisoner of war rather than an object to be used. The trembling came from cognitive dissonance so complete that her body couldn't reconcile expectation with reality. That night, she wrote in her notebook, July 28, 1944, "I begin to understand that we were lied to about the British. Not small lies to boost morale, but fundamental lies about who these people are. They guard us and do not harm us. This should not be remarkable, but after years of propaganda, it feels like witnessing a miracle." The night patrols became a regular observation. Different guards, same professional distance. They walked their routes, checked the fence line, ensured all women were accounted for before curfew. Sometimes they helped, like the night Emma Richter, a young factory worker from Essen, twisted her ankle on the path. 2 guards responded to her cry, one fetching the camp medic while the other stayed with her, not touching but present, ensuring she wasn't alone in pain. The medic treated her ankle with the same care he'd give any British soldier: bandaged, elevated, given aspirin for swelling. Small acts of basic human decency that shouldn't have felt revolutionary, but did. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It accumulated like rainfall, each small kindness a drop that eventually filled a reservoir of doubt. A guard sharing his cigarette ration with women who'd run out. Another teaching some of the younger Germans to play cricket during off-duty hours, patient with the rules, laughing when they got it wrong. The cook in the mess hall who always gave Margaret an extra slice of bread because he noticed she was thin. These tiny gestures chipped away at the edifice of propaganda that had defined their understanding of the world. Margaret made a friend among the guards, if friend was even the right word. His name was Corporal William Fletcher, a man from Yorkshire who'd worked in a textile mill before the war and spoke in an accent so thick the translator sometimes struggled. He'd fought in North Africa, been wounded at Tobruk, and now served out his time on guard duty while recovering from injuries that left him with chronic pain in his left leg. He found her one evening in August, sitting under the oak tree again, writing as the sun set in shades of orange and gold. "You write a lot," he observed, his voice carrying that Yorkshire bluntness that could sound harsh but wasn't. "Recording our crimes?" Margaret looked up, startled. Her English was improving from listening to the BBC broadcasts. "No crimes to record," she said carefully. "That is the problem." Fletcher sat down on a nearby bench, not too close, always that respectful distance. "What did they tell you about us? About the British?" She hesitated, then chose honesty over evasion. "They said you were weak, made soft by democracy and racial mixing, that you treated prisoners with cruelty because you lacked the discipline of a proper military hierarchy, that your empire was dying and you would take revenge on Germany for hastening its end." Fletcher's laugh was short and bitter, not unlike the laugh of men everywhere who've been asked to fight for countries that don't quite live up to their promises. "Soft, are we? After 5 years of this bloody war?" He paused, looking out over the compound. "And they were wrong about the prisoners?" "Yes," Margaret said simply. "Very wrong." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the evening sounds, birds settling for the night, distant voices from other parts of the camp, the soft wind through oak leaves. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, more like two people processing the gap between what should have been and what was. "Why do you guard us?" Margaret asked. "Why not send younger men? Combat troops?" Fletcher shifted, his leg clearly bothering him. "Young men are for fighting. Old men like me, damaged goods. We're for minding prisoners. They figure we're steady, less likely to do something stupid." He looked at her directly. "Also, most of us remember the last war. Saw enough horror to last 3 lifetimes. We're not keen on adding more, even to enemy prisoners." "But we bombed your cities, killed your people. My brother died in the bombing. Surely some of your comrades died in German raids." "Aye, they did." Fletcher's voice was flat, heavy with unspoken losses. "Lost my cousin in the Blitz. Lost mates in North Africa to German shells. Lost my marriage to this bloody war because I came back different than I left." He paused. "But you're not the ones who killed them, are you? You're just women who were in the wrong place when the war found you. Taking revenge on you wouldn't bring my cousin back. Wouldn't fix what's broken. Would just add more cruelty to a world drowning in it." This answer was more complex than Margaret could fully articulate, but she understood its essence. A man who'd lost much, and still chose not to perpetuate loss. A soldier who'd seen enough death to understand that more death solved nothing. The moral equation didn't compute according to anything Goebbels had taught about British weakness. "In Germany," she said slowly, "they would have killed you, just for being an enemy soldier. The SS would have shown no mercy." "I know," Fletcher said. "That's the difference between your lot and ours, isn't it? We remember we're human, even when it's hard, even when we've earned the right to forget." That night, Margaret's notebook entry was longer than usual. "I am beginning to understand that strength and mercy are not opposites. The British are not weak because they treat us with dignity. They are strong enough to resist the easier path of cruelty. This is a kind of power the Reich never understood. The weeks accumulated into months. August became September, the English weather turning cooler, mist in the mornings lasting longer. The war news on the BBC painted a picture of Germany's collapse. Allied armies pushing toward the Rhine, Soviet forces crushing Army Group Center, cities falling one after another. The women listened to these broadcasts with complicated emotions. Horror at their country's destruction, relief that the nightmare might finally end, guilt that they were safe while Germany burned. In September, something remarkable happened. The camp received permission to organise a small theatre production. This came from Major Ashworth's belief that idle prisoners made trouble, that activity beyond work was necessary for mental health. The women could put together an evening of entertainment, nothing elaborate, just songs and skits performed in their own language for their own amusement. The two actresses from Berlin took charge. They organised rehearsals, wrote simple sketches that mocked camp life gently, taught songs that weren't political, just folk tunes and popular music from before the war. The British Guards watched these preparations with bemused tolerance, occasionally helping move benches or string lights for the makeshift stage area. The performance happened on a Friday evening in late September, as autumn settled over the English countryside. The entire camp attended, guards and prisoners together, sitting on benches in the mess hall. The sketches were funny, self-deprecating, making light of their situation without being political. The songs were beautiful, women's voices blending in harmonies that seemed to carry all the longing and loss of displacement. Margaret watched Corporal Fletcher watching the performance. His face showed something she hadn't seen before. Not quite emotion, but a softening, a recognition that these enemy prisoners were people who created beauty even in captivity. During one particularly lovely folk song, she saw him wipe at his eyes quickly, as if something had gotten in them. But she knew better. The song had reminded him of something, someone, some life before the war made monsters of ordinary people. After the performance, as women filed back to their huts in good spirits, Fletcher stopped Margaret. "That was beautiful," he said simply. "Thank you for sharing it with us." "You didn't expect enemy prisoners to have culture?" she asked, but without accusation. "I don't know what I expected," Fletcher admitted, "but I'm glad I was wrong." October brought news of the failed German offensive in the Ardennes, the last gasp of the Wehrmacht, throwing everything into one desperate push that collapsed under Allied firepower. The women received letters from home, when mail could get through, describing conditions that made their imprisonment seem like salvation. Starvation widespread, cities reduced to rubble, refugees fleeing the Eastern Front with stories of Soviet brutality that made propaganda seem understated for once. Margaret's letter from her mother in Stuttgart described eating wallpaper paste, trading family heirlooms for potatoes, sleeping in basements, while American bombers turned the city to ash. The letter ended, "You are blessed to be in England." At least the British remember civilization. This created a psychological inversion that was almost unbearable. The prisoners were safer, healthier, better fed than their families back home. Being captured by the enemy was better than remaining free in Germany. The guilt from this realization sat heavy on the women's shoulders, a weight that no amount of rationalization could lift. Some women, like Frau Weber, still clung to the old ideology. She insisted this was temporary, that Germany would yet prevail, that the treatment here was an elaborate deception before the real punishment began. But her voice grew weaker each week, drowned out by evidence, by daily experience of dignity, by the simple fact that the world she'd believed in was collapsing into rubble. Most women went through their own transformation, quieter than Margaret's but no less real. They began to question everything they'd been taught. The camp had a small library, books in German, that had been donated by refugee organisations. Women read these books obsessively, British newspapers that reported honestly about the concentration camps being liberated, about the horror discovered at Bergen-Belsen and Dachau, about the industrial machinery of extermination. Some women refused to believe it. Others, like Margaret, spent hours staring at photographs, trembling, finally accepting the evidence of atrocities committed in their country's name. "We didn't know" became a refrain repeated like a prayer. We didn't know about the death camps, but some had known, or had chosen not to look, or had known and decided it wasn't their concern. The guilt settled over the camp like the autumn mist, cold and inescapable. The British Guards never lectured about it, never gloated over Germany's collapse. They simply continued their duties with quiet professionalism, letting the women process their own reckonings. These men who had every reason to hate because of the Blitz, because of lost comrades, because of years of brutal war, chose instead a kind of disciplined compassion that served as its own lesson. One evening in November, a terrible storm rolled in from the Irish Sea. Wind that shook the Nissen huts, rain so heavy it overwhelmed the drainage ditches, turning the compound into a maze of puddles and mud. Thunder, like artillery fire, lightning that lit the camp in stark white flashes. Some of the younger women panicked, remembering bombing raids, the sound too similar to forget. The guards responded immediately, not with force, but with calm. They moved through the huts, checking that roofs were secure, that no one was injured, that fear hadn't turned into hysteria. Corporal Fletcher found Margaret sitting on her bunk, shaking, arms wrapped around herself. "Reminds you of the bombing?" he asked gently. She nodded, unable to speak. He pulled up a stool, sitting at a respectful distance. "It's just a storm. You're safe here. The huts are solid. They've weathered worse." "Why do you care?" The words burst from her. "Why do you care if I'm frightened? We were enemies. We bombed your cities, killed your people. Why don't you just let us suffer in our fear?" Fletcher was quiet for a long time, the rain hammering on the curved metal roof, the world outside lost in darkness and water and wind. Finally, he spoke. "Because someone has to remember that war doesn't erase our humanity, that enemies can become something else when the guns stop. Because if we become like the worst of what we fought against, then what was the point of fighting?" Margaret cried then, truly cried for the first time since her capture. Not from fear or exhaustion, but from the grief of understanding how thoroughly she'd been deceived, how much had been lost in service to lies, how the world she'd believed in had never actually existed. Fletcher sat with her until the storm passed, not speaking, just present, a silent witness to the collapse of certainty. December brought word that repatriation would begin in the spring. The war was clearly ending. Germany's defeat, no longer a question of if, but when. The women would be sent home, to whatever remained of home, to face the ruins and the reckoning. Major Ashworth called an assembly in the mess hall, all prisoners and guards together. He stood before them, looking older than his years, the weight of command evident in his posture. "The war is ending," he said, and the translator rendered his words into German. "You will be sent home to Germany in the coming months. The process will take time. Until then, camp operations continue." He paused, looking out over the assembled women. "I want to say something before you leave. When you return home, people will ask about your time here. Some won't believe your accounts. Some will say you're lying, that you've been brainwashed by British propaganda, but I need you to tell the truth anyway." The women listened in absolute silence. "Tell them that British soldiers guarded you and did not abuse you. Tell them that democracy, for all its flaws, still chose to treat you as human beings deserving of dignity. Tell them that the ideology that brought you here was built on lies about British weakness, about the superiority of authoritarian systems, about what happens when mercy is mistaken for softness." His voice grew stronger. "Your government committed atrocities. Millions murdered in camps, in gas chambers, in mass executions. That is what happens when a nation forgets that power without morality is just another form of barbarism. That is what happens when you believe some humans are less than others. The silence was absolute. Even the building itself seemed to hold its breath. We're sending you home to rebuild Germany. Don't rebuild the same nation. Build something better. Build something that recognizes the strength in showing mercy, the courage in choosing compassion, the wisdom in treating even enemies as human beings. That's the only way forward. That's the only way any of this suffering matters. Major Ashworth stepped down. The assembly dismissed. That evening, Margaret sought out Corporal Fletcher. She found him at his usual post near the gates, smoking, watching the winter stars appear in the cold, clear sky. "I need to tell you something," she said in English that was much improved after months of practice. He nodded, gestured to a nearby bench. She sat, gathering her thoughts. "Before the war, I believed what they taught us, that Germans were superior, that other nations were weak or corrupted, that showing mercy was weakness, that strength meant domination. I believed this easily because it made me feel important, part of something larger than myself." She paused, finding the difficult words. "And I believed what they said about the Jews. Not everything, but enough. I knew they were being sent away. I didn't ask where. I told myself it wasn't my concern. I told myself the government must have reasons. I told myself many lies to avoid facing what my country was doing." Fletcher listened, his weathered face unreadable in the darkness. "I cannot undo what I believed. I cannot undo what my country did. But I want you to know that I see now. I see the lies for what they were. I see that your strength was not weakness, that our supposed superiority was actually corruption. And I am more ashamed than I have words to express." The silence stretched between them like a bridge, but a guard on the tower above called out the time. 10 o'clock. Another hour until shift change. "Hate is easy," Fletcher said finally. "It's the simplest emotion there is. Point at someone different. Blame them for everything wrong. Never have to look at your own failings." He lit another cigarette, the match flaring briefly in darkness. "But dignity is harder. Treating people right, even when they don't deserve it, even when you've earned the right to cruelty, that takes real strength. That takes courage the Reich never had." "Will you forgive me?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Fletcher looked at her directly. "That's not mine to give. The people who died in those camps, the ones who suffered under your government's madness, they're the ones you need forgiveness from. Most of them are gone now." "Then what do I do?" "You live differently. When you go home and people start talking about the old ways, the old hatreds, you speak up, you say no, you tell them what you learned here. You become the kind of person who would have resisted, who would have hidden the Jews, who would have chosen the harder path." He stood to resume his patrol. "You asked once why we don't just let you suffer. It's because we believe people can change. We believe Germany can learn. We believe there's still a chance to build something better from the ruins. Don't prove us wrong." Repatriation began in March 1945. Groups of women processed out, given papers, loaded onto lorries heading south to ports, then onto ships heading to a Germany that no longer existed as they'd known it. Margaretta's group was scheduled for April. The last weeks in the camp felt strange, suspended between two worlds. Women walked the compound memorizing details, understanding they were leaving safety for chaos. On the final evening, guards and prisoners gathered informally in the mess hall. No official ceremony, just people acknowledging what had passed between them. Some women shook hands with guards they'd come to know. A few exchanged addresses, promising to write though none really believed they would. Most simply nodded, recognizing the peculiar intimacy of captivity. Emma Richter approached the guard who'd helped her with her twisted ankle. She'd learned enough English to say, "Thank you for treating me like a person." He smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "Take care of yourself over there. Build something good." Margaret found Corporal Fletcher one last time. They stood near the gates where they'd talked so many evenings, the April night soft and full of spring promise. "I will remember this place," she said. "I will remember what you taught me." "Remember what you learned," he corrected gently. "I just guarded. You did the hard work of changing your mind." "Will you remember me?" she asked. He considered this. "I'll remember that people can change their minds, that even after terrible things, there's possibility for something better. That's what I'll carry forward." They shook hands formally, the gesture carrying more weight than any embrace could have. The next morning, lorries came before full light. Women loaded their few possessions, letters from home, notebooks filled with observations that would have been impossible to imagine a year before. They filed out through the camp gates, past the guard towers where men they'd feared had instead protected them, past the fence that had held them safe rather than simply captive. Major Ashworth stood at the gates, saluting as they passed. A small gesture, but significant. Respect offered even to defeated enemies. The lorries rolled south through an England waking to spring. Green fields, lambs in pastures, villages where ordinary life continued. A country that had been at war for 6 years but still maintained its essential character, still chose civilization over barbarism. The ship back to Germany carried 400 prisoners, men and women from various camps. During the crossing, they shared stories, compared experiences. Some men from other camps spoke of harsh treatment, guards who were cruel, conditions that barely met Geneva Convention standards. They were bitter, unchanged, ready to resurrect old grievances as soon as possible. But the women from the Manchester camp told different stories. Stories of British guards who had treated them with professional dignity. Stories of being fed, protected, respected. Stories of learning that everything they'd been taught was a lie. Some of the men didn't believe them, called them collaborators, brainwashed, weak. But others listened, perhaps beginning their own reconsideration. Margaret stood at the ship's rail as the German coast appeared, grey and cold under April skies. Beside her, Emma shivered in her thin coat. "Are you afraid?" Emma asked. "Yes," Margaret said. "But different than before. Before I was afraid of punishment, of suffering. Now I'm afraid I won't be strong enough to live differently, that the old ways will be easier and I'll fall back into them." "Then we help each other," Emma said. "We remember together." The ship docked at Hamburg, or what remained of Hamburg. The city was rubble, entire neighbourhoods erased, survivors moving through ruins like ghosts. The women stepped onto German soil, no longer the same people who'd left it. They had crossed an ocean, lived among enemies they'd been taught to hate, and learned that humanity could survive even the worst propaganda. In the years after, Margaret Schmidt became a teacher in Stuttgart. She taught history, but honestly, she taught about the camps, the atrocities, the lies that had led Germany to ruin. And she told her students about England, about British guards who had maintained their humanity even when guarding enemies, about learning that strength and mercy were not opposites, but complements. Some parents complained. Some called her a traitor to Germany. But others listened. And slowly, painfully, a generation began to learn different lessons than their parents had. Emma Richter married a British soldier during the occupation and moved to Yorkshire. She lived 4 streets from Corporal Fletcher's family. Their children played together. When people asked how she could live among the British, she wrote back, "Because they're just people. Because everything we were taught was a lie. Because there is no master race, only the human race trying to live together." Major Thomas Ashworth continued serving until his retirement in 1952. He never spoke publicly about his time commanding prisoner camps, but he kept letters from some of the German women, letters describing their new lives, letters of thanks, letters proving that even enemies could learn to see each other as human. Corporal William Fletcher returned to Yorkshire and worked in the textile mills until they closed, then became a union organiser and local council member. When asked what gave him faith that people could change, that hatred could be overcome, he told the story of German women in an English camp who learned to question everything they'd been taught. What happened in that camp outside Manchester and places like it across Britain was not widely known for decades. It didn't fit comfortable narratives. It was too complex, too nuanced, too much at odds with simple stories of good versus evil. But it was real. German prisoners, including women, were held in camps across Britain during the war's final years. Many were guarded by older soldiers, veterans who'd seen enough war to understand that more cruelty solved nothing. And those encounters between women who'd been taught that the British were weak and guards who showed them dignified strength became a small part of their transformation. Not the official denazification program, but something more personal. The daily experience of having your deepest beliefs contradicted by reality. Historians later noted that German prisoners held in Britain often returned with different perspectives than those held elsewhere. They had seen a country that maintained its values even under extreme pressure. They had experienced the contradiction of being treated humanely by people they'd been taught to despise. These experiences didn't instantly create Democrats out of Nazis, but they planted seeds of doubt about totalitarian ideology. They proved that propaganda could be overcome by direct experience. They demonstrated that even enemies could be treated with basic decency, and that such treatment could change understanding. The camp where Margaret Schmidt spent 9 months no longer exists. The Nissen huts were dismantled, the land returned to farming. If you visited the site today, you'd see only fields, perhaps a small plaque noting that a POW camp once stood there. But the impact of what happened in that space continues. Every student Margaret taught about choosing truth over comfortable lies. Every child Emma raised to judge people by character rather than nationality. Every person who heard these stories and chose to see humanity in everyone. The German women who encountered British guards on those first night patrols expected the worst. They found professionalism instead. They expected exploitation. They found protection. They expected confirmation of their prejudices. They found evidence that everything they believed was wrong, and in that gap between expectation and reality, something extraordinary happened. Not dramatic, not cinematic, but real and lasting. People changed their minds. People learned to see differently. People chose to build their lives on new foundations. That is the quiet victory that no army can achieve. That is the transformation that happens one person at a time, one moment at a time. One recognition at a time that the enemy is human too. In the end, it wasn't British military might that defeated Nazism in those women's hearts. It wasn't re-education programs or propaganda. It was the simple experience of being treated with dignity by people they'd been taught to despise. That is the lesson that echoes across 80 years. That is the truth that survives when all the hatred is forgotten. That is the hope that remains when everything else has been destroyed. Humanity is not determined by nationality or ideology. It is chosen daily in small acts of decency. It is proven by how we treat those we have power over. It is built by people who, having every reason for revenge, choose something better instead. The women who left that camp in spring 1945 carried that lesson home with them, back to a destroyed nation that desperately needed to learn it. Some shared it. Some lived it. Some passed it on to children and grandchildren. And somewhere in that chain of transformation, in that quiet accumulation of changed minds and opened hearts, the world became slightly better than it was. Not perfect, not redeemed, but better. And sometimes that's enough.